Angel Island lies at the north end of San Francisco Bay, just inside the Golden Gate Bridge. Visitors can bicycle and hike the 740 acres of this California state park and National Historic Landmark. One of the best views of the North Bay is from the top of Mount Livermore on Angel Island. However, all of this natural beauty belies the history of the island. For the first part of the 20th century, Angel Island was a detention center for over 1 million immigrants, mostly Chinese. Angel Island was the Ellis Island of the West Coast. On August 13th of this year, 2005, this detention center was closed to the public for a 2-year renovation project. I was there to film the public's last look at the immigration station on Angel Island. The first Chinese entered California in 1848, and within a few years, thousands more came, lured by the promise of Gamsan, or Gold Mountain. During this period of great migrations, the Chinese met a reception unlike that given to European immigrants on the East Coast. Discriminatory legislation forced them out of the gold fields and into low-paying menial jobs. They laid tracks for the Central Pacific Railroad, reclaimed swampland in the Sacramento Delta, developed shrimp and abalone fisheries, and provided cheap labor wherever there was work no other group wanted or needed. By the 1870s, the gold rush had turned into a bust, but Chinese immigration accelerated, aided by a series of droughts in the rural Pearl River Delta area in the southeastern province of Guangdong, a Cantonese-speaking province. The Chinese were accused of being unable or unwilling to assimilate into American society. Public sentiment and organized labor began to advocate for restrictions on the activities of Chinese. In response, politicians passed over 600 ordinances and laws against Asians throughout the U.S. Far from being passive victims, the Chinese in America won many precedent-setting cases, and in some instances, even reparations for damages. But in 1882, the U.S. government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. For the first time in the history of the United States, immigration was limited strictly on the basis of nationality or race, and it would not be the last. Many Chinese men in America during the exclusion era had wives and children residing in China. Families were separated for years or even decades. As a result, normal life and community development in the rural villages of China and the early Chinatowns of America suffered greatly. The question soon arose of how to implement the Chinese Exclusion Act. At first, customs officials arbitrarily administered exclusion, but in time, the procedures became standardized. As they did, exclusion enforcement fell upon the Bureau of Immigration, the forerunner of today's Bureau of Citizenship and Immigration Services. Much of today's immigration policies and fears stems from the Chinese exclusion period. During this period, Chinese attempts to enter America turned to desperate measures. Friendly members of the white community would bear false witness to a person's residency. Corrupt immigration officials could be bribed. False birth certificates would be issued. Officials who were discovered often found employment with prominent immigration attorneys. To further control Chinese immigration, the United States government opened a detention center on Angel Island in 1910. It was billed as the Ellis Island of the West, but within the Immigration Service, it was known as the Guardian of the Western Gate. It was designed to control the flow of Chinese into the country. For 30 years, from 1910 to 1940, this was the entry point for approximately 200,000 Chinese immigrants coming to the United States. Most were detained on Angel Island from 2 weeks to 6 months until their applications were approved. Many were denied entry. By contrast, European immigrants and first-class passengers usually faced only an inspection on board the ship and were never detained on Angel Island. Viewed from the dock, the administration building is to the left in the foreground. The hospital is behind it in the background. The detention barracks are mid-center, and Julia Morgan designed employee cottages are at the top of the photo. Chinese detainees expressed their feelings in poetry that they brushed or carved into the wooden walls of the detention center. In the decades that followed, the walls were puttied and painted over. Many of the poems that were carved into the walls of the center are still legible today. Under normal lighting, the walls appear as peeled paint, but with a little trickery, the poetry rises like invisible ink from the walls. In 1924, the U.S. passed the National Origins Act. This act limited immigration by reducing the allowable number of entries to 2% of the number of foreign-born members of that same nationality already living in the U.S. The 1890 census was used as the base for setting these quotas, further discriminating against the newer immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, favoring immigration from Northwestern Europe, and barring immigration from the Far East. This law prevented many Eastern Europeans from immigrating to the United States during World War II. One class of Chinese the U.S. could not keep out were those who were already citizens of the United States by virtue of having a father who was a U.S. citizen. Then, as now, any person born in the U.S. is automatically a citizen, regardless of the status of their parents. And the children of citizens are also citizens, regardless of where they are born. Hence, any Chinese who could prove citizenship through paternal lineage could not be denied entry. Those without true fathers in the United States became paper sons or paper daughters. They bought papers which identified them as children of American citizens. And because official records were often non-existent, an interrogation process was created to determine if the immigrants were related as they claimed. The papers and study books the immigrants bought included detailed family information, which they studied in order to pass the interrogations. Types of questions in the interview included, how many chairs are in your home in China? If you walk out the front door, what do you see? If there was a discrepancy, the paper son would often say, well, it's been 6 years since Dad was home. How would he know what's there now? The cost for buying a paper father was $100 per year of the immigrant's age. Even today, people who came through the immigration station are hesitant to appear on camera, give interviews, or allow me to use their name in this film. However, Mrs. May D. was visiting the immigration station the day I filmed. She is in her late 70s and came to Angel Island in 1939. She and her husband owned a store in Chinatown for many years and now enjoy their retirement in San Francisco. With her family, I was able to tour restricted areas of the immigration barracks and make this film. One of the park rangers told me that each week, immigrants return to visit the barracks and relive their memories. In 1940, an electrical fire destroyed the administration building at the detention center. The Bureau of Immigration abandoned the island later that year. During World War II, Angel Island was a transfer station for POWs. Japanese prisoners would pencil on the walls their numbers, their origin, and add destination unknown before being shipped to mainland POW camps. The Chinese exclusion laws were not repealed until 1943, when China was our ally in World War II. However, a quota of only 105 Chinese were allowed to legally immigrate each year. The immigration quotas were finally abolished by the Kennedy and Johnson administration with the 1965 Immigration Act, putting an end, finally, to Chinese exclusion. Angel Island and the immigration station were turned over to California State Parks for management and stewardship. The traumatic experiences the Chinese community had faced were rarely, if ever, mentioned to future generations. By 1970, the buildings were deemed unsafe and scheduled for demolition. The Julia Morgan-designed employee cottages were part of a controlled burn that appears in the Warner Brothers movie The Candidate. Before destruction could begin on the detention barracks, a park ranger, touring the barracks with a flashlight, rediscovered the calligraphy carved on the walls. With the help of translators and photographers, the Chinese poetry was once again revealed to the public. Since that rediscovery, the Park Department has begun to preserve the barracks and remaining buildings of the immigration station. In 1997, the Angel Island Immigration Station was declared a National Historic Landmark by the National Park Service. A couple of years from now, after massive restoration and preservation, the immigration station on Angel Island will reopen to the public. This landmark represents a bleak period in American history, but it also provides clues for the origins and ancestry of some of America's most prominent citizens. As we move forward in time, America again confronts issues of immigration. How many? From where? And how do we treat them? Our experience on Angel Island will help answer these questions.